Chapter-2. Eddie gave away every one of his instruments and all his musical equipment and brought the cat out to his countryside childhood home, Father's Farm. Eddie had been born Edward Franklin Stryker on March 12, 1953, in Arlington, Virginia. He was the third of 5 children, a girl and 4 boys. Carlin, the oldest, Chris, Eddie, Graham, who had special needs and to whom Eddie was especially kind, and John, all except John with flaming red hair. Eddie was expelled from school for wearing his too long. The kids' mom and dad, Diane and Art, grew fruits and vegetables, kept animals, and raised their children in a 1960s back-to-nature alternative lifestyle in a log cabin that, with Eddie and Chris's help, they had built themselves in the secluded hills of rural Haymarket, Virginia. The nearest neighbors were a mile away. It was hippiedom, Eddie later described. He shared a room with Chris, which, in the style of the times, he first painted black and then covered with iridescent day-glow red and green swirls and images of a solar system and stars, a rising sun, and fantastical creatures racing through the cosmos. Art grew high THC strains of marijuana, paid for, he said, by the CIA. There was always pot around, and other drugs and drinking, and the farm was the regular site of big blowout parties. Art wasn't Eddie's biological father, but he was all of the kids' dad, a musician, collector, amateur historian, and hot-tempered, self-educated radical philosopher, quick to argue and hard to get along with. As Eddie got older, he and Art were often at odds, even, as one friend described, at each other's throats. Art and Diane were both creative artists with a love for crafts and music. He built and played several string instruments, and she played the auto harp. Music was rich in the family, John remembered. The whole household revolved around music. Once or twice a week, they held song fests at the cabin, inviting local friends and musicians to come to sing and play together. As art became more difficult and he and Diana got into more conflict, Eddie, wanting to bring the family closer, had the idea for them to all write music together. Quote, "One of our favorite things to do," Diana later told John and Carlin, "was for the whole family to get together and sing folk music. Your daddy would play the guitar." As for religion, Eddie recalled, "My father was a Lutheran, and for the first few years of my life, we would go to church, where Art, Diana, Chris, and he would sing and play holy music. My mother was a Roman Catholic, but she didn't appreciate that it was so hard to get answers, like when she would ask the nuns questions, and they would say, 'Don't ask these kinds of questions, or you'll go to hell.' So she more or less defected. When Eddie was 5, Art put a 5-string banjo into his hands and taught him to play in the traditional clawhammer style. Next, he gave him a git fiddle, a guitar, and showed him how to play bluegrass, traditional folk music from the Appalachian region with roots in English, Scottish, and Irish ballads and dance tunes, which Eddie later credited as, quote, "my roots, early influences." And before long, the whole family was performing as a group, playing at festivals and other bluegrass events, sometimes with the renowned guitarist and banjo player Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs and their band, the Foggy Mountain Boys. From their elementary grades on, Chris and Eddie performed at school talent shows and assemblies, Eddie singing on guitar and Chris singing harmony, featuring folk songs by the left-wing singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie. They played at regional competitions and over time began to do shows at fairs and other gatherings, passing a hat for contributions. Quote, "Good money for those days," Diane remembered. From his early teens, Eddie was an innovator, experimenting with mixing different styles, sounds, and instruments. Once, he took the top section of Carlin's alto saxophone, the sound of which, saxophones generally, he never much liked, and attached it to his flute, which he'd played in the high school orchestra. He built speakers out of television consoles and constructed other musical equipment. Quote, "He had a really good construction logic," one bandmate described, and he learned quickly. Eddie joined a family friend's acid rock band playing Jimi Hendrix-inspired electric lead guitar. Quote, "He was also an excellent flautist," John recalled. Musically, he pretty much excelled at anything he pursued. The family cabin sat at the foot of the wooded Bull Run Mountains, part of the Blue Ridge chain of the Appalachian Range, where thousands of soldiers had died during the Civil War. Virginia had been a Confederate state, and Union troops had set fire to the town of Haymarket, burning all but 3 houses and the church to the ground. The kids all had experiences with ethereal spirits whose presence even visitors could perceive, and the family would stand at the kitchen window and gaze out on the ghosts of soldiers riding through the woods on their horses. As John described it, quote, "The area was alive with shadows of the past." Eddie sometimes played with ghosts in the hills, letting them try to possess his body and then kicking them out. And, as he told and others in the family confirmed, he learned astral projection by which he could witness distant events. He was, said John, very connected to the universal energy, the creation force. He was picking up on the anima loci, the natural spirits who lived there, Diane agreed, and in his strong spiritual connection to the land, he was picking up on the people who had been there before, on the all-creator and the fact that we were all one. As a child, Eddie wanted to be a Native American, and for one birthday, his parents got him a kit to make a traditional headdress, which he and Diana constructed with turkey feathers they'd dyed red. Quote, "I told him that he had to have Indian parents to actually be an Indian," she remembered, "and he was so mad at me because I wasn't one." The woods were a sacred place for Eddie, and he and his siblings would follow animal trails up into the hills. When he learned flute, he would wander through the streets playing as the family's goats followed behind. "One day I was tromping through the woods," Carlin remembered, "and I could hear what sounded like a bird, a wood thrush, but it wasn't a bird. It was a flute sounding like a bird. And sure enough, there was Eddie sitting on a log with his flute, and I could hear lots of wood thrushes singing, and he was playing their songs back to them. There must have been at least a dozen singing all around him. Sometimes they'd go into a counterpoint thing, the wood thrushes taking part of his song. It was so unbelievably beautiful. I just stopped and watched and listened." The whole family hunted and fished for food, and Eddie was an excellent shot, but he loved animals. The family had lots of them: cats, dogs, ducks, geese, guinea pigs, horses, goats, and a donkey, and raised collies, Pekingese, chickens, and ponies. Eddie's first pet was a drake he'd named Susie. Through the H4 Club, a youth group organized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, he bred Nubian goats, showing them and winning prizes at country fairs, even first place with his favorite, Wonder Girl. He would get extremely upset whenever he found a cricket or grasshopper with an injured leg, and when one day Diana accidentally stepped on an ant, he was mortified and decided he would become a bug doctor and learn how to put splints on insects' broken limbs. But he was also full of humor, the family mischief maker, and his siblings never knew what he might do next. Once, still a young child, he found a mason jar full of cash his parents had been saving to buy a car, taken it into the bathroom, and flushed the bills down the toilet one by one, fascinated by how they looked swirling down. By the time his parents found him, 3/4 of their savings were gone. When Eddie got a wild idea, he would get what his family called the gleam in his eyes and pronounced, "Ah, I got a good one." Early one April Fool's Day, when Art was sleeping in and the kids couldn't get him out of bed to take them to the store, Eddie rushed into the bedroom shouting, "Daddy, Daddy, there's a big hole in your guitar." Daddy bolted out of bed, Carlin remembered, charged into the living room and grabbed his Martin. "I don't see a hole," he said, and there was Eddie, a huge grin spread across his face. "April Fools," he'd called out, laughing. It was just the guitar's sound hole, but at least he'd gotten Art out of bed. Now, in 1973, Eddie was returning to the farm, carrying what little remained from his renunciation giveaway: his cat, a couple sets of clothes, the chanting beads he'd been gifted at the temple, and a few books, Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, the Ishopanishad, and a dictionary. His parents had broken up. Diana was living in another town in Virginia. Art had spiraled into a sinkhole of depression, drinking, and drugs. Looking back, Chris and John agreed, even though Eddie had what John called a, quote, jubilant spirit, and they all enjoyed, in Chris's words, spikes of relative pleasure. And we did love going out, exploring and communing with nature and playing music together. It hadn't been a particularly happy childhood for any of us. We were living with our father's despondency, John remembered, of the days of separation. His anger, his alcoholism, his hell. It was a destructive environment. Eddie had escaped, gotten out, and it wasn't just an escape, it was also a cleansing of all the negative stuff that was happening. He was going through a cleansing process. But now Eddie was asking if he could stay a few days to think about his life. Quote, "I was trying to figure out how I could move into the temple in just one day," he recalled. "And I couldn't do that, but I wanted to move in that direction. So I decided I would stay at my father's farm for a while and start reading the Bhagavad Gita." The importance of chanting was emerging too, because in the Gita, Prabhupada would refer again and again to the Mahamantra, and then there was the instruction that I should try to chant 16 rounds. He was still smoking pot even as he read and chanted. Quote, "But contradiction or not," he said, "it was all having a very serious impact on me." When it was time to feed his cat, he filled a bowl with milk, and remembering what the devotee at the temple had told him, held the bowl to his heart, closed his eyes, and intoned, "Hare Krishna." For the next few days, Eddie sat at the kitchen table reading and trying to chant. In the Gita's introduction, he read, quote, Bhagavad Gita is best understood by a person who has qualities similar to Arjuna's. That is to say, he must be a devotee in a direct relationship with the Lord. It made sense, he thought. Arjuna understood what Krishna was saying, so if he wanted to understand the Gita, he too had to develop a direct relationship with Krishna. And Prabhupada was suggesting that he could. He was especially struck by Prabhupada's list of the 5 different types of relationships one could have with Krishna. One could be a devotee, quote, in a passive state, in an active state, as a friend, as a parent, as a conjugal lover. He reached for his dictionary and looked up the word conjugal, quote, of or relating to the married state or to married persons and their relations. For example, newlyweds in a rapturous state of conjugal happiness. He could hardly believe it. Prabhupada seemed to be telling him that he could attain a direct, romantic, spiritual relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He wondered how a man could be inspired to develop a conjugal relationship with Krishna. But the Gita was clear. We are not these bodies. His current body was male, but that wasn't his real self, his true spiritual identity. He kept reading, quote, every living being out of the many, many billions and trillions of living beings has a particular relationship with the Lord eternally. That is called Swarup. By the process of devotional service, one can revive that Swarup, and that stage is called Swarup Siddhi, perfection of one's constitutional position. That was his goal, he realized, what he wanted to achieve, and he wanted to achieve it in this lifetime. Prabhupada explained that the way to realize one's constitutional position was to chant the Hare Krishna mantra, what he called the Maha Mantra, the great mantra. Eddie decided to give it a try. Quote, I was used to chanting Om in relation to other spiritual groups, he said, so I was thinking that this mantra was also similarly chanted, long and drawn out. He crossed his legs in a lotus yoga position, grasped the first bead next to the big one that marked the beginning and end of the loop, closed his eyes, and with a deep breath began chanting, Hare Krishna. Another breath, then Hare Krishna. After 10 minutes, he felt tired and opened his eyes. Looking down at his beads, he saw that there were still nearly 100 left to finish one round. How could the devotees do 16 rounds every day? It seemed impossible. How do they do it, he wondered. One early morning, when Eddie felt ready to take another step towards surrender, he left the farm and hitchhiked the 60 miles to Georgetown, where he had seen the devotees chanting on the streets. He just wandered around until he heard the faint but unmistakable clinking of hand cymbals. He ran toward the sound, and as he got closer, heard the booming of drums and began to make out a dozen young voices singing the Mahamantra. When he turned a corner, he saw a group of devotees dancing away from him down the street. One of them, Lakshmivan Das, saw Eddie running toward them, quote, like an elf fresh out of the forest, long red hair streaming behind him, a loose shirt flowing over a pair of shorts, and Eddie's round, rosy, boyish face lit up by a wide smile. As he caught up with the devotees, one of his sandals slipped off, but he just kept going with one shoe, chanting with the group. Your shoe fell off, one of the devotees, Padma Malini Dasi, told him. That's okay, he said. I might lose you. I'm staying with you guys. For the next week, Eddie hitchhiked into Georgetown every morning to join the devotees' Sankirtan party and stayed with them all day and into the night, chanting Hare Krishna and handing out copies of their Back to Godhead magazine. And over the next few weeks, he became more and more involved and brought books, posters, and chanting beads home for his siblings, shared what he was learning with his friends, and introduced both groups to the devotees. Quote, he was always expressing a kind of awe, Lakshmivan remembered. I would tell him some basic point of Krishna consciousness, and he would look at me with the most earnest expression. His mouth would open wide, and he'd nod slowly and say, "Oh." He was just absorbing everything, in retrospect, very seriously. At night, Eddie would follow the devotees back to the temple, drink hot milk with them, and listen to them read aloud about Krishna from a book with his name. Then he'd hitchhike back to the farm, getting in around midnight. He was happy, John recounted, joyous and blissful. He had the bliss of the spirit within him, and he showed that. With his long hair, however, Eddie felt out of place among the devotees. All of the men had shaved heads. Quote, a week later, he recounted, I was begging to be allowed to shave up. Well, one devotee answered, a shaved head is really for people who live in the temple, chant 16 rounds every day, and follow the 4 regulative principles. They wanted to make sure I was going to follow, he remembered, that I wasn't going to shave up and then go smoke dope or something. In fact, he had brought a bag of pot with him, quote, just in case. So he climbed out the 4th-story ashram window onto the fire escape and emptied his bag into the wind. As for his long hair, the devotees offered an alternative to shaving. Quote, for now, why don't you just tie it back in a braid, one suggested. Then it won't fly around all over the place. So he began to go out with the Sankirtan party wearing a red braid that hung down past his waist. On Sundays, the street chanting ended a few hours early so the devotees could prepare for a feast at the temple. When they returned on Eddie's first Sunday out, some devotees were already in the temple room, holding beads in their hands and murmuring the Mahamantra to themselves. So, that's how they do it, he thought. As more devotees and guests sat down, the kirtan began, and after a while the lead singer stood up and demonstrated a dance he called the Swami step, and everyone joined in. Then one of the devotees spoke about the Bhagavad Gita and answered questions. That was followed by another kirtan, louder and more lively than the first, with everyone in the crowd, Eddie included, dancing with abandon. When the kirtan came to a close, the dancers collapsed to the floor and then, after repeating a few short prayers, sat in long rows. 2 or 3 of the devotees walked down the line, serving out food from metal buckets, and before he knew it, Eddie, who had hardly been eating, found himself seated before a plate piled high with exotic preparations. At first, he just picked at the food. When the devotee who had been feeding the squirrels and birds on his first visit asked why he wasn't having more, he explained, quote, if I understand karma right, it's sinful to kill things just to eat. So I try to eat as little as possible. She smiled and said, that's nice, but in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that those who eat only food they offer to him in sacrifice are freed from all karma. That's why we eat only prasadam, spiritualized food. It's been offered to Krishna, so it has no karma. Eddie surrendered himself to the concept and to the mountain of food in front of him. Rice, a vegetable curry, cauliflower pakoras, and, quote, the most incredible strawberry halava ever. When he finished, he was offered more, and then again, and before the night was over, he'd had 5 plates of the prasadam, including 20 of the thin, crispy papadum wafers, poppers. He was one of the last people still sitting, munching the last bits of a popper, when a devotee came up to him and asked, "How would you like to do some devotional service?" "Sure," he replied, "I'd love to." Who wouldn't, he thought. The idea sounded attractive, almost exotic. "Great," the devotee said, "let's clean up." Eddie figured they were mopping the floor so the temple room could be closed up, but when he and the devotee were done cleaning, everyone came back for another kirtan. The singing and dancing went on for another 2 hours, alternately building and retreating, then getting faster and louder. Eddie lost all sense of himself in the waves of the mantra. Krishna's name was so sweet, so engaging. Quote, my eyes were closed the whole time, and I was just dancing and dancing and dancing. It was so ecstatic and blissful. When the kirtan ended, I opened my eyes, and everything was so vibrant and amazing. The whole world was surcharged with spiritual nature. Then he became aware of a sharp pain, the soles of his feet throbbing, blistered. Late one Saturday night back at the farm, Eddie sat at the kitchen table reading the Gita. "Daddy," he called out, "you gotta hear this. It's incredible." Art looked at him skeptically. "What is it?" Eddie read a few sentences aloud, then looked up to see his father's reaction. "Don't give me that Swami stuff," Art said. "You don't know this, but I read Bhagavad Gita before you were even born." Art had read Swami Vivekananda's version in college. The book had presented a Mayavad, impersonalist perspective, and, quote, didn't do much good for him, Eddie remembered. He was still into every sinful activity imaginable. Next, Eddie's attention shifted to chanting on his beads. Now that he had a clearer idea of how to use them, he wanted to give 16 rounds another shot. It was the night before Easter, past 10, when he closed his eyes and began. Quote, I was completely mesmerized. I was really impressed, amazed, because when I opened my eyes, it was already daylight. Time had passed without me knowing it. It was a dramatic experience for me. I felt like I'd gained a profound experience of what it meant to surrender to the instructions of the spiritual master, to complete the minimum of 16 rounds. So at that point, I made my decision that it was time for me to join the temple. Tomorrow had finally come.